We need them to filter out information. That is in fact what it is about. The public sphere is a domain of society in which people can discuss all sorts of issues, societal issues, political issues, in which they can meet, in which they can express their different opinions, but also a place in which they can criticize the politicians. And this idea comes from Jürgen Habermas, a German philosopher, and his first observation was that public sphere is connected to the European coffee houses in the 18th century. People, but mainly men, met each other in this coffee house, and they read their newspaper and they discussed all sorts of issues. And that, according to Habermas, is the first public sphere as it developed. And that, of course, is a fantastic idea, but it's also a metaphor. Today, we use this idea metaphor for our public sphere, and that is the domain in society in which we discuss politics by reading newspapers, by talking online about all sorts of issues, by watching television and following talk shows. All these different aspects of media and communication together form the public sphere. Well, the offline public sphere, of course, is connected to the online public sphere. Offline public sphere, you could say, is about newspapers in print that I at least read every morning. But offline immediately is connected to online. Because if I read something in my Volkskrant or in my morning paper, then I can send a mail or a blog to the editors. I do not agree with this, or I want to have my say on that. So what you see today is that offline and online are immediately together. Some other interesting issue in today's public sphere is that we can, for instance, be a reader of the Volkskrant in the Netherlands, but we can also follow information on the site of The Guardian or the site of Die Zeit in Germany or the site of Le Monde. All these conventional newspapers are also connected to each other. In the NRC, for instance, in the Netherlands, you can read pieces of the Guardian and the other way around. So everything that is online has a connection to the offline and the other way around as well. That is something positive. Because there is much more news available and much more sources you can follow different sources and you can have knowledge on them. There's also a more negative side, and that is that there are so many sources of information and so many different opinions and so many ongoing discussions that sometimes people have the feeling, where should I base my opinion on? What can this be filtered, all these opinions? And in previous times, the filters were the editors of the newspapers, but today it's not so clear who is editing the news. So it's not so clear for us participating in the public sphere, where does it come from and how can I have a good opinion on this? What is so interesting in today's public sphere, as I said, is all these various opinions, this diversity of news and info and sources and fake news. And what we need in this context is someone who can explain what is going on, or someone who has a deeper thought of some things, or someone who has a very controversial opinion on things. And that is what I call a public intellectual, meaning that people are intellectual, they have an education, or they have a literary oeuvre or an artistic oeuvre or whatever. They have a sort of what we call cultural authority. And based on that authority, they have a say and they have an opinion on what is going on in society in regard to political, ethical, social issues. And these people are public intellectuals. I use the word public for that, and not only me, but many theorists do that. because public means that these people are very much aware of their performance in a public debate. And performance means that you know that you have a sort of posture, that you have a visibility, that you can use one or the other role. So it's not just the intellectual being in public. No, he has thought about how am I most convincing, or how can I get most attention. So being a public intellectual means that you are very much aware of the publicity connected to your role as an intellectual. The word intellectual was used for the first time in regard to a protest that was done by a group of intellectuals in Paris at the end of the 19th century. And what happened was that someone was accused, Dreyfus was his name, and it was not completely clear why this was, what had happened. And then Émile Zola, the famous literary author, the novelist, opposed to this accusation, and he sent a letter to the newspaper, and he wrote in this letter, "J'accuse. I do not agree with the president of the Republic of France." And a group of intellectuals, meaning authors, journalists, university professors, artists, joined him in this protest. And then this group was called in other media the intellectuals. And from then on, so the end of the 19th century, it was clear that intellectuals, if they want to have an influence in the public debate in society, had to use media, for instance a newspaper or television or radio, that was late in the 20th century, in order to make their point. So intellectual was something that we know also from the 18th, of the 17th, or even before centuries, but the typical intellectual activity connected to Zola and others is that they very much were aware of their visibility in society. And that is interesting, that has developed further. What you see in the 20th century is that people, writers, artists, intellectuals are using their power in a very smart way on television, for instance. Jean-Paul Sartre did that in France, or Heinrich Böll in Germany, or George Orwell in the UK. In the Netherlands, you could think of someone like Harry Mulisch. He followed the Eichmann process in Jerusalem as a journalist, and then he came back home in the Netherlands and he explained to the Dutch audience what happened in Israel and what his opinion, he had a very strong opinion on that, what his opinion was. So what you see is the writers have an idea, but also a presence in the media, and they try to reach as much people and as many audiences as they can reach, and that is new. And that developed even further. Now we have the online public sphere, and what you see now is that public intellectuals, aware of their visibility on the media, are using their social media in order to attract attention for their books or literary texts. Or on the other hand, they give interviews on television in order to promote a certain idea. Or they do a TED Talk and they are spread all over the online audience in order to say something more about their books or works or whatever. So the whole on and offline activities in the media are much more combined, and that gives public intellectuals much more power. And then, of course, the question, why do we need public intellectuals today? And my answer to that is that the public sphere is so complicated, so many different opinions, sources, forms of information, that we need some people who can give more in-depth perspectives or who have thought about certain aspects. We need them to filter out information. That is, in fact, what it is about. What I explained is that it is important that you have cultural authority, that you have knowledge, and that you know what you are saying and what is going on. But there also is an interesting paradox or tension in this being of a public intellectual, because what is important is that someone is not responding immediately to what is going on in politics, let's say. Politicians always immediately react, and they have a say if something happens. Okay, this is my explanation. I think this of this and that of that. Typical of the public intellectual is that he, at some time, at some points, is there in the public domain, public sphere, but at other times he is detached. He stays in his room at his desk behind his computer. He thinks, he reads, and he comes with an opinion, let's say, a few weeks later after some event happened. And the point is that I think that this distance, or take your time for having a thought on this and developing an opinion, is very important. That is the, let's say, intellectual part. And that is what I mean by the paradox or the tension. You have to be, as a public intellectual, engaged, but also detached at times. Female intellectuals are part of our society. However, we are not seeing them so much. So we don't see them because we are biased and only looking at male intellectuals, professors, writers, because it is more obvious to look at them than to have a view on the women. There was an interesting dissertation defended at Amsterdam University not so long ago by Corine Kolen, and she explained that we have more male authors than female authors, and the female authors, even if they are less, are also considered less, so less intellectual, less interesting, less good writers, and so on. And again, that is something that has to do with the bias. We are beforehand less interested in women than in men. Another explanation that is given why there are less female intellectuals in today's society is that women are not so interested in being so visible, for instance, in a talk show. If you think of a talk show that we have in the Netherlands, a very famous one, De Wereld Draait Door, there are many, many more men who want to participate in this talk show than women. And they have done research on that. And again, the fact is that women think, I don't want to have a say in 3 minutes and then do a one-liner and so on. That's not so interesting. I like to have more time. I like to explain my thoughts, but not as a sort of act in a circus or something. And then the third explanation that is given why women are less visible in society as public intellectuals is that they are less interested in these rational discussions that are supposed to be important in the public sphere, and they would be more interested in another perspective or in a more trivial or emotional or other type of discourse. And my point of view is that all these 3 different explanations have to be combined. They are all plausible. But the most interesting thing that I see happen is that if we have female public intellectuals, they are very capable of getting on in-between positions, on being both rational and emotional, or visible and not visible, or very much a persona and at the same time a very sympathetic, modest person. Maybe it's good to give you an example of someone who's really convincing what she has to say. Someone like Zadie Smith, for instance, author born in the UK, multicultural background, and now she's living in New York. She has written some fantastic novels, but the most interesting thing about her work is that she also is an essayist, and she writes very personal, but at the same time very political, explaining essays on what is happening, for instance, in the UK society. For instance, in regard to Brexit. She immediately after Brexit happened, she very clearly explained what happened and why her community or her group of friends and acquaintances had not seen what happened, why they lived in their sort of bubble and did not see what was happening. And it was at the same time a very logic, rational, well-argumented piece, but also a very willing piece, willing to understand what had happened. And I think she's so convincing in doing that, and we need more voices of people who like to do this and to express their thoughts on this. Another exciting example is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, a female writer as well. She was born in Nigeria. She now lives part of her life in Nigeria, part of her life in the United States. And she has, as we say, a migrant background, but she went to the US because she wanted to study there, to do their university studies there. And she has written fantastic stories and novels on being someone who was born in Africa and now works in the United States, but also on people who are traveling in between these countries. And I think she has a lot of knowledge on what it means to move away from the place where you were born. And besides that, as I told you before, it's very important that you have a presence and that you are an interesting person to look at and that you are visible. She is absolutely a beautiful woman, but she also dresses up and she plays with the different codes and styles of Africa and America. And in doing that, she, I think, is important for different audiences, as said, in Africa and the United States, but also for people of my generation, but for younger people in particular. She's very attractive and she has an important role as a coach or a mentor or a teacher. And that is typically a public intellectual, of which I think this is an important woman in today's public sphere.